The world record bass. This is a topic that on this channel and on my Instagram and with my peers that are close to me, I've had discussions about because I kind of have this big plan of moving to Japan to chase the world record bass. And this has been a goal that I've had for quite a few years now, and my buddy Marshall is also in the race for it. And I'm sure there's a lot of guys that are also still thinking about chasing the world record bass. Now, to catch the world record bass, you obviously have to live in a place that has a world record bass. And this discussion has gone back and forth between obviously California, Texas, South Africa, Japan, and those are kind of the main four places that people are talking about where there's a possibility of catching that world record size bass. And so, I've been going to Japan for the past, year and a half now, and I absolutely love Japan. I love Lake Biwa, and I know that fish is there. A lot of my buddies on Lake Biwa that fish there regularly say that they see that fish. Obviously, I believe that it's also in California. Do I believe it's in Texas or South Africa? Quite possibly, maybe. But I always kind of just go off the statistics of where giant bass have been caught previously. So, two 20-pounders have been caught in Japan, one from a place called Nanairo, and the other place, Lake Biwa. Then you have California, which has had the most 20-pounders caught out of it, and those were only caught in like two or three lakes. And so Southern California, I still believe, has that world record size fish. When it comes down to like Texas and maybe some other places in the country, most other places in the country, their biggest fish is like 18 pounds. So, the state record in Texas is an 18 pounder caught in Lake Fork back in the 90s. And that's the biggest fish. Obviously, you have O.H. Ivy that's pumping out a lot of giant bass right now, but the biggest one that's been caught is a 17 pounder. So even at its kind of peak or its prime that Ivy was at, only a 17 pounder was caught. You would think with that amount of people going with the technology now that a fish that was 18 or higher would have been caught by now already. But that's not kind of what we're talking about today. We're talking about how the records have now completely changed because of decisions that IGFA have made recently that have kind of flown under the radar that a lot of people don't even know yet, and maybe because people don't take it seriously or they don't know about it, or people don't care about the world record until somebody might catch one and put it on a scale and there might be buzz about it. But since I'm trying to chase after the world record, this was brought to my attention by my good buddy Mike Gilbert, and so I kind of wanted to discuss what IGFA has done and why I think it's not the smartest plan that they've had, but it is what it is. So if you guys are ready, let's get right into today's video. So if you go to IGFA and you type in bass, world records, they now have categorized bass in two categories. You're going to have largemouth bass, and then you're going to have Florida bass. Before, these two things were combined, and the record for these fish were obviously the Manabu Kurita fish from Lake Biwa in 2009 at 22.5, and then you had George Perry's fish that was 22.4 caught in 1932. A 77-year difference, which is an insane amount of time for there to not be that record class fish that was caught, even though California was pumping them out in the 90s. Maybe Texas had a shot, Mexico, and all these other places, but yet it was never really broken until Lake Biwa. And so those records obviously was deemed like this is the world record fish. However, since IGFA has now since basically separated the two strains of bass, which everybody kind of already knows now. The northern strain bass is, in a sense, a northern part of the country bass that has been adapted and have lived their lives up in the northern parts of the country. So we're talking like Minnesota, Michigan, New York, and all those areas up there. And then obviously the Florida strain fish are the fish that stay further in the southern areas originating from Florida. But obviously they have worked west and they have made it all the way to California now. So those two strands of fish are very, very different. If you didn't know, northern strain fish, they do not grow as large as a Florida strain fish. However, there are benefits to fishing for northern strain fish. They are shorter, but they're stockier. They're a little more aggressive. They're not so susceptible to weather changes and patterns changing. And overall, if you ever go up north and you go to like Minnesota or Michigan or Wisconsin, those fish are very, very aggressive. They're very healthy looking fish, but they just don't grow in length as much as the opposite fish, the Florida strain bass, do. A Florida strain bass will grow in excess of 25, 26, 27, 28 plus inches long, which is completely unheard of when it comes down to northern strain fish. But the Florida strain fish are more susceptible to weather changes overall. You hear guys talk about like, oh, a cold front came through and the Florida strain fish actually didn't really like it that much, and it takes a while for them to change their behavior, while it seems like a northern strain fish is up and atoms always. It's constantly ready to go and feed. And that could be different reasons why, but that's just kind of the difference between the northern strain and Florida strain. Another thing is the northern strain bass, they don't school up as much as the Florida strain bass do. This is something that is present in a lot of different places. I've seen it in Southern California. I've seen it in Texas, where those Florida strain fish, they like schooling up, while the northern strain, they'll be like more in wolf packs, I would say, maybe 3 to 5 fish, where there will be little schools of 20 plus bass that are Florida strain, and they kind of work together. It's very, very interesting, and you can tell that they think very differently, but it's very cool. And when you have those two different fish, what has been the main goal with those two fish is to actually crossbreed them and make the legendary F1 bass. The F1 bass is kind of regarded as the best genetics to grow the biggest bass possible. And this is very apparent in places like Lake Biwa and other places around the country in the world, that when you breed these two, you get a beautiful mix of, you take the northern strain thickness, healthiness, their aggressiveness, but you combine the length and the schooling factor that you'll see in the Florida strain. So it's an absolute perfect blend to make the F1, and that's why so many places are trying to breed the perfect F1 bass. This F1 is kind of regarded as what most people think are the biggest bass that are ever caught over 20 pounds. Most people speculate that in Lake Biwa, that 22 pounder that was caught was a hybrid between the two. The original strands of bass that actually were introduced in Japan were northern strain fish. However, in the 70s, the Florida strain bass were actually brought over from a lake in Southern California called Lower Otay. Lower Otay is well known in Southern California as a giant bass factory, or, well, at least it was. Legendary trophy hunter Mike Gilbert, his personal best came out of Lower Otay, a 17 pounder, and it was a big, long, fat, gluttonous fish. So that strain of Florida strain bass made their way across the ocean to Japan, and what is thought to have happened was the Florida strain and the northern strain on Lake Biwa, they came together, they bred, and they created that first generation of F1 bass. And that first gen of F1 bass are kind of considered the best generation of the F1s. It seems like when you breed the two, the F1s through generations will start to lose traits from one side or the other. And so that first generation, maybe the second generation, are a true giant bass, and we saw it. I think Lake Biwa was pumping out a lot of giant bass. There was a lot of forage, but we haven't seen that caliber of fish be caught like it once was. And so that first generation of F1 bass is really, really special. Now, this is where the world record is kind of gets a little muddy. So you have that record of the 22.5, 22.4 that was tied between Kurita and Perry. However, since IGFA has completely, basically gotten rid of the idea of F1 bass, and now you have Florida strain and northern strain, what doesn't make a whole lot of sense is, as we talked about, northern strain do not get as large as a Florida strain bass. Maybe the largest northern strain bass we'll get is maybe 12 to 15 pounds or so, right? And that's it. Then you have Florida strain that can grow up to that, 18, 19, 20, 20 plus range, right? Well, those old records, the 22s, those are grandfathered into the northern strain, or what's now being called the largemouth bass category of records, which, if you're paying attention, that doesn't really make sense. I was talking about how biwa and those fish were probably hybrids or F1. So why are they going into the largemouth or the northern strain category? Well, IGFA just finds that this is something that they've done in the past where they have to grandfather the old records into some category and they just put it in the largemouth category. There's actually a podcast that I was just on, Bass After Dark. They had a few of these individuals from IGFA and other fisheries, and they kind of went over and explained what they're doing and kind of a better explanation than probably what I could say.
And so now, with the largemouth bass being retained, the world record being retained at 22 pounds, we could almost guarantee as fisheries managers that we're not going to break that largemouth bass record again because we can't use Florida genetic with that. So that record stands forever.
And in my eyes, it's biologically wrong because it's got Florida genes in it. Every one of those fish have Florida genes.
Probably. Almost certainly. Certainly,
right.
It's against the preponderance of the evidence. Now, I used to be a lawyer, so you guys are biologists, I'm a lawyer. We're coming at this from wildly different directions.
So what is the biggest natural northern that has ever been documented?
Thank you.
And I would defer to Andrew and Steve on that in terms of pure northern. I mean, I can look through our record books into locations of where our largemouth bass records have been caught, but I don't know if you guys, I haven't done that in the past. If you guys know off the top of your heads?
Well, if
this is actually.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, Terry, that's a great question. Since we've done all these taxonomic revisions, we've literally even learned that the ranges we thought Florida bass was in was wrong. We don't have new updated calibrated growth curves for what a pure largemouth top end growth is. We would only have anecdotal. As far as I know, there's been no paper that's kind of adjusted for that. So we would only have our own like angling anecdotes to go off of there.
Well, you could look at some state records and make some estimations or educated guesses, but you don't know what the bucket biology history might be. Like, for example, Virginia has a state record that's, I think, 16 and a quarter. Of course, Massachusetts has a state record that's 15 and a half, which, we don't have any way to check the genetics on that. But if that were a legit fish, you'd have to say that's in the neighborhood of the biggest northern largemouth.
If you take the California record that was caught in 1940 that lasted until the Orville Ball experiment was 14 pounds even, and it came out of a trout stock lake and up in Northern California. And I'm pretty dang sure that was a northern strain, or what you guys are calling a largemouth bass these days.
Right.
So,
and if you take all the Great Lakes states and you look at their average state record, you're talking 12 pounds.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
The answer is somewhere between 12 and 15 pounds. That's where it is.
Yep.
So we now have a 22-pound record. We have a 10-pound delta that we're not going to overcome.
So you guys are okay with the fact that you've just established a world record that is perhaps 6-7 pounds out of reach, and that's okay?
I'm not necessarily saying that's okay, Ken. I'm saying that's the precedent that we have set in previous situations with other species when we've made adjustments like this, and to fall in line with that, it's what we've had to do moving forward with this species as well. Now, I mentioned to you earlier too. We talked about, and there's certainly a case to be made, right? We talked about it here at length, and we are open to listening to the angling community. It's something that we pride ourselves on around here too, and we talked about this in the pre-show. I mean, you certainly, if you could file a formal protest on any existing record that we have, and with enough evidence to back it, and we would lean towards Andrew and Stephen and black bass experts to help us adjust and change any decisions we have moving forward with enough evidence behind it. And so that
I take you at your word, Zach. I believe you. I know IGFA wants to do the right thing, but to wait on a panel of anglers to come out and try to challenge that, we all know that's not going to happen, because nobody thinks about a world record until they've got it on the bank and they threw it on a scale.
So, in that clip, you have Ken Duke, the basically the host of Bass After Dark, kind of just question like, hey, like, is this really how it's working? Is it fair? Like, and obviously, IGFA is going to follow IGFA. They're going to say what they're going to say. And so basically now for the northern strain fish, if you want the official world record northern strain of largemouth bass, you would have to catch a pure strain northern bass that weighs 22.7, I guess now, which is literally impossible because the biggest northern strains ever recorded are like 12 to 15 pounds. So they're asking for somebody to catch a bass that's 7 pounds. It's impossible. It's impossible for a pure northern strain bass to reach 22 pounds. It's just impossible. However, the Florida strain record then opened up because it was brand new. There was nothing there. However, a guy named Kyle Hall in Texas was fishing OHIV back in March of this year, 2024, and he caught a 15-pounder. He got basically all of the DNA, the applications, the weight, and all that stuff certified. And now, when you type in IGFA bass and you go to the Florida strain record, Kyle Hall has the world record bass at 15 pounds and something ounces for the Florida strain category. So now you have these two categories. You have the northern strain category that has a 22 pounder in it, which will never be beat. That obviously those fish, George Perry's and Monobus fish, were not northern strain. And to be put in these categories, it needs to be scientifically proven that it's 100% northern strain or Florida strain. If it's not, then basically IGFA is not going to count it. It's not going to even look at it. But they put those fish in the northern strain category. So for guys that have northern strain bass, they basically gave you the middle finger that you'll never be able to beat this record ever. Absolutely. Where before it's like, okay, if you made it actually a northern strain fish that was 12, 14, 15 pounds, maybe a guy in Massachusetts can catch a giant, or Washington, or anywhere else, right? New York just had a 12-pounder be caught as their new state record. But they basically said, nope, 22 pounds is now the definitive record that will never be beat ever. So throw that away. So now you have Florida strain, which kind of opened up, and 15 pounds will be easily broken within the next year or 2 years, just because you have places like Texas doing a Sri-Lanka program, which is a fantastic program for trying to grow giant bass. You just have to hope that when you catch that 16, 17 plus pound bass and you do the DNA, that, if there's 10% of it that's northern strain, they're not going to count it. So it's become more of a process. And obviously to a normal bass fisherman, if you catch a giant bass, you're like, it's a bass, It's probably a Florida strain, but it's kind of hard to tell between an F1 Florida and a Florida that has maybe more Florida traits to it than northern. It just then comes a process of sending in your DNA to IGFA and them checking to see if it is 100% a Florida strain bass. So what does that mean for me chasing the world record? Well, that means that basically if I caught a 22-pound 7-ounce fish or a 23-pound largemouth, if I move to Lake Biwa and I get blessed with the opportunity of catching one that big, IGFA will basically not recognize it as a record. Like, it's just not, because most likely on Lake Biwa through the years and years, a fish, if you catch a fish out there, it's most likely a mix between a Florida and a northern strain. So the DNA will most likely not match up to being 100% a Florida strain bass. Is there a possibility? Absolutely. However, I do feel like Florida strain bass and the northern strain bass, when they mix and they make that F1, the F1s are truly the giant fish that you're chasing after for. So, it's very strange, and I don't think the bass fishing community will really be up in arms until that comes, or if it ever comes. And I think that's kind of what IGFA is banking on, that nobody will ever catch a 22 plus pound bass ever again, to where there won't be like, wait a minute, this guy just caught a 22 8 ounce fish, shouldn't he have the record? And obviously if you catch a fish that big with social media now, I mean, that will spread like wildfire, and everybody will know like that's the biggest bass ever caught, and they're going to look at IGFA to recognize that that's the biggest bass ever caught. But then IGFA probably will not respond, probably won't even acknowledge it. And I think the bass fishing community, and maybe even further beyond that, might be like, hey, what's going on? Like, this guy should have the record. He caught the biggest bass ever recorded. Here's the proof, here's that. But then IGFA is like, sorry, that fish was 30% northern strain and 70% Florida strain, so it doesn't count. And I think that's where the turmoil and the pitchforks might come out, and IGFA might face some backlash then. But for me, deep down inside, if I was to catch a 23-pound bass, I know that I beat the record, at least in my own mind. I'm not really breaking it for IGFA, but I'm just breaking it for the general consensus of the bass fishing world that like this is the biggest bass ever caught. And I don't really care if IGFA puts it on the website. It would, if somebody does catch that fish, whether it's me or Marshall or anybody else, everybody in the world will know that that is the world record bass. So what do you guys think of the new rule changes? Obviously, it's opened up records that are more easily beat, I suppose, unless you start getting into places where there's F1s involved. And honestly, that's a lot of places. A lot of these original places that were stocked with bass were northern strain. Here in Arizona, I believe in the beginning, all we had were northern strain fish, and we had some fairly large northern strain fish. However, in recent years, game and fish, as well as some very supportive bass fishermen have come together and said, hey, let's try doing what Texas is doing and introducing Florida strain bass in some of our lakes. And they've been doing this program now for, I want to say 5 years, maybe 6 years now. And so I think a lot of the fish we're catching are just straight up F1 bass. Now, I don't think a world record bass lives in Arizona, but as you can tell, like F1s are kind of the fish that everybody wants to have in their lakes or ponds or anything like that, because they grow large, they're aggressive, and it's overall a very, very good fish to have in a fishery for a bass fisherman. So for right now, I'm always just thinking ahead of being like, I just want to try and catch a world record. I think I'm young enough and I have ideas in my heads of how to do it and so on and so forth. And as long as I beat Marshall, the homeless fisherman, to it, that's all I really care about. I don't care if it's on IGFA, as long as I beat that guy. But other than that, thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know what you guys think on the whole world record change. If you like it, don't like it, so on and so forth. Let me know with a comment down below. Other than that, we'll see you guys on the next one, and go out there and chase your dreams.